If you've been following the news out of Washington and the Persian Gulf this week, you've likely felt a distinct shift in the air. A shift from the thunder of kinetic military operations to the paper-thin, yet incredibly hostile, theater of global finance. On Wednesday, President Donald Trump took to Truth Social to announce what he termed the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country. He promised economic warfare and isolation on an unprecedented scale, a campaign that the administration is branding as Economic D-Day. The White House is warning allies and adversaries alike: fall in line or face the consequences. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was even more blunt on social media, declaring that any remaining tie to Tehran will hasten a nation's economic oblivion, whether that tie be purposefully constructed or willfully ignored. But we have to look past the capital letters and the social media bluster. Why now? Why this sudden, explosive escalation of economic warfare? The truth is, this is not a declaration from a position of absolute strength. It is a desperate pivot. We are staring down a conflict that is dragging toward its 6-month mark, a war launched by the US and Israel back in February that is now visibly stalemated. On the military front, there is a total lack of movement, and President Trump is growing increasingly frustrated. In public, talks with Iran are officially on hold. Meanwhile, Tehran continues to keep a partial, suffocating grip on the Strait of Hormuz. With crucial midterm elections looming at home and the administration under heavy fire over the domestic impact of this war, Economic D-Day looks less like a masterstroke of foreign policy and more like a high-stakes diversion. To understand why the White House is so eager to pivot to the financial front, you have to look at what's actually happening out on the water. For months, the administration has tried to project an image of overwhelming naval dominance in the Middle East. But behind the official press releases, a very different, much grimmer reality has been unfolding. On Wednesday, a new U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, led by the USS George Washington, arrived in the region. Ostensibly, this is a routine rotation and a buttressing of our military presence. But the carrier it replaced tells the real story of this war. The USS Abraham Lincoln has finally been sent home after a grueling deployment that began all the way back in November 2025. For months, sailors aboard the Lincoln lived under conditions that can only be described as horrific. Reports have emerged of severe food shortages, broken plumbing, and, most tragically, a number of suicide attempts among the crew. These are the men and women carrying the physical weight of Trump's stalemated conflict. When these conditions became public, they provoked a wave of fierce domestic criticism, exposing the human cost of a military campaign that has yielded little to no strategic progress. At the same time, the financial drain continues to mount. Just this week, the U.S. approved a potential $4.5 billion sale of aerial refueling aircraft to Qatar. Qatar, ironically, has been acting as a key mediator in Washington's war with Iran. We are pumping billions more into military hardware in the region, even as the administration tries to convince the American public that they are winding down the physical fighting. The human toll on our service members and the endless flow of defense dollars have made the physical war deeply unpopular at home. And when a military strategy fails to deliver a quick victory before an election, politicians do what they always do: they look for a new battlefield. Enter the economic arena. The administration's new strategy is simple: if you can't defeat Iran on the battlefield, you force the rest of the world to starve them out. The United States has openly warned its closest allies and China that they must join this campaign, vowing that Washington's ultimate goal is now to collapse this regime in Tehran. Let's pause on that phrase: collapse this regime. For months, President Trump and his officials insisted that this war was strictly defensive, that the sole, narrow objective was to stop Tehran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's recent comments have completely stripped away that diplomatic pretense. By openly talking about collapsing the regime, the administration has confirmed what critics have feared all along. This is, and always was, a war of regime change. And how do they plan to achieve this? Through blunt force global coercion. Besant's threat of economic oblivion isn't just directed at America's adversaries. It is a loaded gun pointed at our allies in Europe and Asia. It is a zero-sum ultimatum. Cut every single economic, diplomatic, and trade tie with Iran, or face the full, destructive wrath of the U.S. financial system. But the biggest target in this economic campaign is China. Despite a heavy U.S.-enforced naval blockade in the Gulf, Iran has continuously found ways to bypass American restrictions.
How?
By operating a highly organized shadow fleet of tankers. These tankers, which are already under international sanctions, managed to slip through the blockade to keep Iran's oil flowing. And who is buying that oil? China. Beijing is, and remains, Tehran's single largest economic lifeline. This sets up an incredibly dangerous diplomatic collision course. Treasury Secretary Besant has publicly called on Beijing to get with the program, while claiming that many of these conversations are best to have in private. This pressure comes at a highly delicate moment, as Chinese President Xi Jinping is scheduled to visit the White House on September 24th. What makes this coercion so striking is the sheer hypocrisy and inconsistency of the administration's rhetoric. It was only last year that Trump boasted he did not think he will need China's help to end the war. It was only a couple of months ago that Trump publicly thanked President Xi and Vladimir Putin for remaining neutral in the conflict. Now, with the military campaign stalling, that false confidence has evaporated. The administration has gone from thanking Xi for his neutrality to threatening China with economic oblivion if they don't abandon their primary energy partner. It's an erratic, desperate shift in posture that exposes a complete lack of long-term strategic planning. Unsurprisingly, Tehran has dismissed this economic offensive as nothing more than political theater. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi hit back on social media, branding Economic D-Day as a clumsy attempt to divert attention away from America's own deep structural crises. Araghchi pointed directly to the elephant in the room: America's unprecedented national debt and its surging interest costs. And he has a point. As the U.S. continues to fund multi-billion-dollar arms deals in the Middle East and maintain carrier strike groups indefinitely at sea, the domestic economy is buckling under the weight of deficit spending. The Iranian Foreign Ministry issued a formal statement charging that these sanctions constitute economic terrorism and crimes against humanity. They argue that by intentionally targeting the fundamental human rights of every Iranian citizen, the U.S. is waging a war on ordinary civilians, not just the regime. And history suggests they are right. Decades of damaging American sanctions have failed to dislodge the government in Tehran. Instead, they have systematically hollowed out the Iranian middle class, restricted access to life-saving medicines, and bred deep-seated resentment. Araghchi warned that doubling down on failed policies will only bring further defeat and the lasting enmity of the Iranian people. Even the administration's own leadership seems to acknowledge the immense risk of this strategy. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking on a conservative podcast, admitted that this economic offensive is a delicate dance.
Why?
Because, as Vance acknowledged, Iran is not a passive actor. They will actively try to apply economic pressure to us. By partially closing the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most vital energy transit choke point, Iran has already demonstrated its ability to send shockwaves through global energy markets. If Trump's economic D-Day pushes Tehran entirely into a corner, the resulting spike in global oil prices could easily trigger a severe economic recession in the West. Once again, the administration is playing a dangerous game of chicken, risking global economic stability just to secure a political win ahead of the midterms. So, where does this leave us? We are watching an administration that has backed itself into a corner. The physical war they launched in February is stuck in a costly, exhausting stalemate. The service members they deployed are suffering from military mismanagement and deteriorating conditions. And the domestic public is growing increasingly hostile toward an endless conflict. Rather than admitting the failure of this military campaign, the Trump administration is doubling down. They are attempting to mask a stalemated war by launching an aggressive global economic campaign that threatens to drag our allies and global trade partners into economic oblivion. Treasury Secretary Besant has tried to spin this as a peaceful alternative, suggesting that maximum economic pressure means there will not be a large-scale kinetic restart. But even he had to add a chilling caveat. I will emphasize that is for now. This is not a strategy for peace. This is an admission of military failure disguised as economic strength. It is a policy of collective punishment that targets the basic human rights of millions of ordinary Iranians, while risking a massive global economic backlash that will be felt right here at home. As President Xi Jinping prepares to visit the White House next month, and as Treasury Secretary Besant prepares to unveil the details of this new economic offensive on Monday, we must ask ourselves, are we watching an administration that is actually in control of the situation? Or are we watching the frantic, dangerous lurch of a government desperate to hide its own strategic failures before the voters head to the polls? Only time will tell. But the costs, both human and economic, are already far too high. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on Monday after Secretary Besant's press conference to break down the actual details of the administration's plan. Until then, stay skeptical and stay tuned.